Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. As you've probably noticed, the Computex coverage has ended. Tim did give me a few days off, so that was nice. Monday and Tuesday he took care of the videos, so you would have seen his mouse review and then his phone review, so they were both very good. But anyway, in that time, I wasn't exactly taking time off. I was doing quite a lot of benchmarking for what's probably been one of the most requested videos probably in the last year. And that is, of course, the revisit of the GeForce GTX 780, one of the most powerful GPUs that existed roughly 4 years ago. That's not why so many of you have been asking for the test though, or at least it's not the main reason. There's been a huge amount of controversy surrounding Nvidia's GeForce 700 series, which is often referred to by its codename Kepler. And for those of you wondering, the Kepler architecture actually made its debut with the GeForce 600 series. The GeForce GTX 680 was the most powerful GPU in the 600 series, packing 1536 CUDA cores in a 294mm square die. The GTX 680 was later refreshed as the GTX 770 with higher clock GDDR5 memory. However, shortly before that happened, Nvidia led with the GTX 780, a brand new bit of silicon. The 780 boosted the core count by a whopping 50%, taking the die size to 561mm squared. That wasn't the full silicon though, as the GTX 780 Ti followed 6 months later with all 2,880 CUDA cores enabled. At the time, these big Kepler parts were mighty impressive. For example, the GTX 780 landed in May of 2013, and back then it proved to be on average 24% faster than the GTX 680 in my tests and 16% faster than the Radeon HD 7970 GHz edition. So as I said, the GTX 780 was king of the hill for 6 months, till the GTX 780 Ti arrived. However, it was AMD's Radeon R9 290 series that were the real issue, and the arrival of the 290 forced Nvidia into some rather hefty price cuts, slashing the GTX 780 from its initial MSRP of $650 to $500 US. Though even here it was a rather weak proposition against the cheaper and faster R9 290. According to my own testing conducted back in November of 2013, the R9 290 was slightly faster in Battlefield 3, Crysis 3, Far Cry 3, Medal of Honor Warfighter, Metro Last Light and Bioshock Infinite. Meanwhile, the R9 290 was a good bit faster in Battlefield 4, Dirt 3, Max Payne 3, Sleeping Dogs and Hitman Absolution. In fact, the only game where the GTX 780 came out on top was Tomb Raider. So the GTX 780 started on the back foot, and the R9 290 was always as fast or often slightly faster. The problem a lot of gamers have is that over the past few years, Kepler-based graphics cards such as the GTX 780 have continued to fall away, whereas the R9 290 and its reincarnation, the R9 390, are still able to hold their ground today. It's said that the GTX 780 has fallen in a heap, and as a result struggles against modern-day entry-level GPUs. So to find out what's going on, I've taken 22 new titles and tested them at 1080p and 1440p to see how the once mighty GeForce GTX 780 compares to the more modern GPUs. In place of the R9 290, the R9 390 will be stepping in, and while I'm sure many of you would have liked to have seen the R9 290 in this battle, let's be honest, clock for clock, there's little to no difference between the 290 and the 390. Also included is the GTX 970 and the GTX 1050 Ti, so it'll be interesting to see where the GTX 780 slots into that picture. Towards the end of the video, I will be showing some side-by-side gameplay footage as well. And finally, all testing was conducted using our Core i7 7700K test system, clocked at 4.9 GHz, and of course the latest AMD and Nvidia display drivers available at the time of testing were used. So let's jump into the benchmarks. Kicking things off, we have Rise of the Tomb Raider, and here the 3GB GTX 780 struggles with the minimum frame rate, only managing to edge ahead of the GTX 1050 Ti by a few frames. An average frame rate of 72 FPS at 1080p isn't bad, though this does only position the 780 between the 1050 Ti and RX 470/R9 390. The 1440p results are much the same, though the minimum frame rate looks much better in comparison to the RX 470 and R9 390 now. That said, the average frame rate is still quite a bit off the pace at 46 FPS to the R9 390's 55 FPS. The GTX 780 isn't a great deal slower than the 970 and Far Cry Primal at 1080p, and this meant it was 24% faster than the GTX 1050 Ti. That said, it was 17% slower than the R9 390, which was good for an average of 63 FPS. The margins grew ever so slightly at 1440p. Here the GTX 780 was 20% slower than the R9 390 and still a few frames behind the RX 470. Still, the GTX 780 is now almost 30% faster than the GTX 1050 Ti. This time testing with Tom Clancy's The Division, the GTX 780 finds itself situated right between the GTX 1050 Ti and GTX 970. This meant at 1080p it was 20% slower than the R9 390. Moving to 1440p, the margin remains much the same. The GTX 780 was 24% faster than the 1050 Ti and 14% slower than the 970. And this puts it well off the pace of the R9 390, as well as the current generation mid-range contenders. Well, the Hitman results are very interesting. Whereas the GTX 780 has previously been found somewhere between the 1050 Ti and 970, it's pretty much on par with the 1050 Ti this time, making it one of the slowest GPUs tested. Of course, this is an AMD sponsored title, but still, the R9 390 was 74% faster. The R9 390 is now 82% faster at 1440p, and again, the GTX 780 is only able to match the GTX 1050 Ti. Hitman's the most recently released game we've tested so far, so it shall be interesting to see how things develop through the next 18 games. Well, this is rather unexpected. Just as we saw the GTX 780 get completely obliterated in Hitman, we now see it pulling away from the GTX 970 in Quantum Break. It's also not a great deal slower than the R9 390, at least when compared to the previous titles. The 780 does drop off the pace at 1440p, though it's still able to match the GTX 970, so that's certainly not a poor result. The GTX 780 also performs reasonably well on Overwatch at 1080p with an average of 149 FPS, and that places it roughly on par with the R9 390. In fact, it was just 4% slower. The GTX 780 remains strong at 1440p, as it turns in a rather strong minimum frame rate. When looking at the average frame rate, it was able to match the RX 470, while it wasn't too much slower than the R9 390. Doom was never going to be gentle with the GTX 780, and here we see a very large dip in the minimum frame rate. Please be aware that the minimum frame rate is based on an average of 3 runs, so this isn't some kind of one-off dip in performance. Although the GTX 780 did keep the frame rate above 60 FPS at all times, we see that frame rates did fluctuate quite a bit here. Moving to 1440p, the variance between the minimum and average frame rate isn't as extreme, but even so, overall the GTX 780 didn't look particularly impressive in Doom, especially when compared to the GTX 970 and R9 390. For Total War Warhammer, the GTX 780 was tested using DirectX 11, as it doesn't support DX12 in this title. Even so, performance was excellent as the 780 matched the 1063GB and the GTX 970 at 1080p. Moving to 1440p, the 780 dropped off the pace ever so slightly, though for the most part provided comparable performance to the GTX 970, 1063GB and RX 470. It was also significantly faster than the GTX 1050 Ti here. Testing with Mirror's Edge Catalyst shows fairly consistent performance across the mid-range GPUs, along with the titans of yesteryear such as the GTX 780 and R9 390. In fact, here the GTX 780 and R9 390 are quite evenly matched, though the Radeon did offer slightly better minimum frame rate performance. Jumping to 1440p, the GTX 780 slips away a little and is now roughly on par with the RX 470. This isn't a bad result for the 780, and frankly this is where I would expect to see it in relation to the R9 390. And here we are, back to very mediocre performance. The GTX 780 churned out just 55 FPS at 1080p in F1 2016, and this positioned it between the 1063GB and 1050 Ti. That made it much slower than the GTX 970 and R9 390. Here at 1440p, the GTX 780 really did no better, as it trailed the R9 390 by a 22% margin with an average frame rate of just 42 FPS. The GTX 780 also sucked when it came time to play Deus Ex Mankind Divided, averaging just 38 FPS at 1080p to the R9 390's 56 FPS. This time though it was found sitting between the GTX 1050 Ti and GTX 970. The 1440p resolution crushes the midfield in this title, and despite providing completely unplayable performance, the GTX 780 wasn't much slower than the 3GB 1060. Here we see that the GTX 780 was able to average just over 60 FPS at 1080p in Battlefield 1, which is of course playable performance despite being much slower than the GTX 970 and R9 390. 1440p though hammered the GTX 780, and now it was just 6 FPS faster than the GTX 1050 Ti, and a lot slower than everything else tested. Well, Mafia III doesn't exactly play well with current generation hardware, so I wasn't expecting the GTX 780 to deliver much. That said, it was able to match the RX 470, albeit with an average of just 38 FPS. Much the same was seen at 1440p, though here the GTX 780 did match the R9 390, though again both averaged under 30 FPS, so it's not really a noteworthy result. The GTX 780 struggles with Gears of War 4 and is well down on the GTX 970 and R9 390. In fact, the 780 sat closest to the GTX 1050 Ti at 1080p with an average of just 56 FPS. Jumping to 1440p slaughters the GTX 780, and now it's seen delivering 1050 Ti-like performance, positioning it miles behind the pack. Despite offering a reasonably smooth 60 FPS at all times, the GTX 780 was still the slowest graphics card tested in Titanfall 2. The GTX 1050 Ti is surprisingly fast in this title, and as a result the GTX 780 came in last place. Moving to 1440p allowed the 780 to claw its way out of last place, if only just. Still, here the performance was very competitive across most of the graphics cards tested. The GTX 780 completely tanked in Civilization 6, at least when compared to the competition. Here it was slower than even the GTX 1050 Ti with an average of 53 FPS at 1080p. Moving to 1440p, the margins remain much the same. Here the GTX 780 was roughly on par with the 1050 Ti, making it the slowest GPU tested. Call of Duty Infinite Warfare saw the 780 just able to deliver acceptable performance at 1080p with an average of 60 FPS. That made it 13% slower than the GTX 970 and 18% slower than the R9 390. Surprisingly though, the 780 actually closed in this time at 1440p, or at least it did on the GTX 970 anyway. It was still 18% slower than the Radeon R9 390. The Watch Dogs 2 performance was quite typical. The GTX 780 was 18% faster than the 1050 Ti at 1080p, but it was also 15% slower than the R9 390. The margin is reduced at 1440p, and now the GTX 780 is just 11% slower than the R9 390. That said though, the minimum frame rate is quite low, and this is something we've seen quite a bit from the GTX 780. The Resident Evil 7 Biohazard results look fairly typical. Here the GTX 780 finds itself situated between the GTX 1050 Ti and the 1063GB, though it was a good bit slower than the RX 470. The 780 also trailed the R9 390 by a 42% margin, so this is another title where we see the Kepler-based GPU aging very poorly. The margins are much the same at 1440p, and here once again the mighty GTX 780 struggles to even deliver playable performance, with an average of just 39 FPS. For Honor isn't a hugely demanding title, and this is evident by the GTX 780's performance, as it managed to match the RX 470 with almost 70 FPS at 1080p. This placed the GTX 780 within striking distance of the GTX 970. Then even at 1440p we find similar results, and here the mid-range graphics cards are all quite similar, a very competitive performance seen, and the GTX 780 was well in the mix. Prey is a very well optimised title, and the GTX 780 had no trouble delivering highly playable frame rates at 1080p. In fact, it wasn't a great deal slower than the RX 470, though it did trail the GTX 970 and R9 390 by over 10 FPS. Moving to 1440p, we once again find similar results, and even at this resolution, the GTX 780 was able to provide smooth gameplay. Finally, we have Dawn of War 3, and well, these are the results that we've pretty much come to expect by this point. The GTX 780 was found sitting between the GTX 1050 Ti and GTX 1063GB, making it around 20% slower than the R9 390. As we found quite a few times, the GTX 780 is able to catch up at 1440p, though that said this resolution has pretty much broken this GPU more than a few times. Anyway, here it averaged 47 FPS, placing it alongside the GTX 1063GB, and that meant it was just a single frame slower than the GTX 970 and RX 470. So, 2 weeks ago I revisited the R9 390, and plenty of you were pretty keen to give it a hard time over power consumption. Well, I get that the GTX 780 is technically an older GPU, but still it consumes quite a lot more power, increasing total system consumption by 11% over the R9 390. The GTX 780 wasn't a great deal faster than the 1050 Ti on a lot of the games tested, yet it increased total system consumption by almost 140%. For those running a 780, you will require a 500 watt power supply to avoid running into any problems. Okay, so that's all 22 games in the bag, and yet we do still have a few more results to look at in a moment. But before we do that, let's have a look at the average performance from all the games just tested at 1080p and 1440p. Then just briefly, we will see how the GTX 780 compares to GPUs such as the R9 390 and GTX 1050 Ti in a few older titles. So first up, let's check out those averages. Here we see that on average, the GTX 780 was 23% faster than the GTX 1050 Ti, but 15% slower than the RX 470 and GTX 970. Not only that, but when compared to the R9 390, it was 20% slower. Now, on launch day for the R9 290, it was just a few percent faster than the GTX 780. Then the R9 390 arrived, and it delivered around 10% more performance than the 290 on average, so it seems over the years the margin has basically doubled. For the margins to have remained much the same, we would expect to see the GTX 780 averaging around 70 FPS at 1080p, and not the 60 FPS that we see. Out of interest, I thought let's take a look back at a few older games, starting with Metro Last Light. Here we see even today using modern drivers, the GTX 780 and R9 390 provide very similar, or basically the same performance. What's also interesting to note here is that while the GTX 780 was just 20% faster than the 1050 Ti in modern games, it's almost 50% faster here when looking at the average frame rate. The same's true for the R9 390, whereas it was on average 7% faster than the RX 470 in modern titles, it's 20% faster here. To quickly verify the Metro Last Light results, I quickly ran the Sleeping Dogs benchmark. Again, the R9 390 and GTX 780 were pretty much neck and neck. There was just a slight variation in the minimum frame rate. Meanwhile, the GTX 780 was almost 30% faster than the 1050 Ti and 20% faster than the RX 470. Before wrapping things up, here's 3 minutes worth of gameplay footage comparing the GTX 780, GTX 1050 Ti, and R9 390 side by side. I know a lot of you guys like seeing the footage side by side, so I thought I'd include this towards the end. But for those of you who prefer the graphs and aren't really interested in watching the gameplay footage, then you can skip ahead. There will be a video index in the description to show you where the conclusion starts. For me, it's quite hard to believe that the GeForce GTX 780 is roughly 4 years old now. I guess that said though, it really is starting to show its age. The 780 was just 23% faster than the 1050 Ti. That's pretty crazy given the GPU is physically 4 times larger, packs more than twice as many transistors, and consumes well over twice as much power. When compared to the R9 390, the GTX 780 has slipped further behind. It's no secret that the Kepler architecture just hasn't aged that well. It's either down to the architecture itself or Nvidia neglecting driver development, or perhaps a bit of both. Either way, we've never seen Nvidia architecture fall away like Kepler has. I don't expect the same to happen to the Maxwell-based GPUs anytime soon, but of course I'll keep my eye on performance. For those of you considering picking up a GTX 780 to try and save some money, my advice would be don't bother. Currently the performance is sketchy at best. Some titles were okay while others were just horrible. So, like I said, sketchy at best. But if you're willing to tweak the visual settings at 1080p, then you can achieve smooth playable performance in pretty much all titles. But again, keep in mind that power consumption is still going to be very ugly, especially when compared to similar performance current generation GPUs. Pricing for the GTX 780 graphics cards online is surprisingly high. People are still asking over $100 US for these things. Most are listed on eBay for between $120 and $150 US. Given you can pick up a GTX 1050 Ti for around $130 US, this would be my preferred option. It might be a slower graphics card, but it's also worlds more efficient, and therefore it will run cooler and quieter. Right now, AMD graphics cards are pretty much out of the question thanks to miners snapping them all up. I would have suggested the RX 470 or RX 570, but good luck finding one of them right now. Anyway, that's going to do it for this one. I'm your host, Steve. See you again soon, guys.